The most frightening moment in any relationship isn't the explosive fight, the broken dishes, or the poisonous words hurled across the room. Those things at least prove someone still cares enough to engage. The real terror begins with something far quieter. A soft, hollow click. The sound of an empath finally going dark. It's the stillness that descends when someone who once felt everything for you suddenly feels absolutely nothing. Stay with me, because what unfolds in this transformation rewrites every rule of emotional power you thought you understood. Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant minds psychology has ever produced, discovered that the human psyche doesn't simply collapse under pressure, it reinvents itself. When an empath reaches their absolute breaking point, they don't just crack or spiral into chaos. They undergo a fundamental metamorphosis, emerging as something cold, precise, and completely beyond the reach of those who spent years exploiting them. We live in a world that confuses an empath's kindness with an endless reservoir. People observe their patience, their repeated forgiveness, and their willingness to absorb suffering as an infinite supply they can drain whenever it suits them. But they couldn't be more mistaken. Jung's research into psychological compensation demonstrates that the mind insists on balance. If you force an empath to bury their own needs, their limits, and their legitimate anger for long enough, those emotions don't simply dissolve. They ferment beneath the surface until they reach a critical boiling point. This is where the real danger lives. When that pressure finally becomes unbearable, the psyche shields itself by flipping entirely. Jung named this phenomenon enantiodromia, the point at which a force transforms into its own opposite. Picture a rubber band stretched to its absolute breaking point. It doesn't remain stretched indefinitely. It snaps back with a force equal to every ounce of tension it stored. For the empath, this means the person who once loved too fiercely, gave too generously, and stayed far too long suddenly collides with a psychological wall. In that collision, the caring doesn't slowly fade, it vanishes entirely. This shift is not a gradual decline you can negotiate or apologize your way through. It is total, instantaneous, and absolute, a complete shutdown of emotional connection. This is the silent shift that blindsides people entirely. One moment, the empath is your greatest champion, the one who validates your feelings and carries your weight as though it were their own. You've grown comfortable using them as a safe harbor to return to after you've mistreated them. Then, without warning, you are invisible to them. You can weep, you can beg, and you can swear you'll change, but the receiver in them has been completely dismantled. Because they poured so much of themselves into being fully present the moment they choose to be fully absent, there is no middle ground remaining. They aren't acting from spite or attempting to punish you. They have simply entered a state of psychological survival in which you no longer register as someone they are obligated to protect. You haven't just lost their love. You've lost their recognition of you as someone worth caring for. That is a void no amount of effort will ever fill again. The emergence of the shadow is the moment the empath's inner architect finally decides to stop constructing bridges for people whose only interest is watching them burn. For years, empaths exist in a state of relentless, unrewarded emotional labor. They don't simply walk into a room, they absorb it entirely. They detect the concealed tension, the unspoken grief, and the barely contained fury of every person around them functioning like a high-powered emotional antenna. This isn't merely a personality quirk. It's a full-time occupation that depletes them to absolute zero every single day. They operate under a beautiful yet devastating illusion that if they care intensely enough, listen long enough, or endure enough pain, they can mend the broken people in their lives. But this road doesn't lead to healing. It leads directly into self-destruction. When the empath finally collides with that wall, the world anticipates a breakdown. People expect them to cry, to crumble, or to reach out for rescue. But what actually occurs is something far more formidable. It's a breakthrough. Jung recognized that when an empath stops caring in the conventional sense, they aren't becoming cold or hollow. They are finally becoming complete. Up until that point, the empath has lived a fractured existence, continuously suppressing any part of themselves that felt harsh, selfish, or guarded. They spent their entire lives repressing their shadow, that darker, protective layer of the psyche that every human being requires in order to survive. The breakthrough arrives when the empath stops fleeing from their shadow and finally extends a hand toward it. Integrating the shadow is like installing a sophisticated security system in a house that has stood completely open for years. This is the part of the soul that inherently knows how to deliver a firm, unapologetic no. It is the part that can identify an emotional vampire, those who feast on your light without ever offering anything in return, from a considerable distance. The shadow understands a brutal truth that the well-mannered empath was too frightened to confront. Not everyone deserves a seat at your table, and not everyone has earned the right to the gold inside your heart. By welcoming this darker dimension, the empath isn't becoming a villain. They are simply becoming someone with a backbone. They are discovering that being a good person does not mean being a welcome mat. This transition is the heart of what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you were genuinely meant to be. In this stage, a crossroads appears where a radical choice must be made. You either choose the world or you choose yourself. For the empath, this choice feels like the ultimate act of betrayal. They have been conditioned by society, family, and toxic partners to believe that prioritizing their own needs is the definition of selfishness. They've been taught that their worth exists only in how much they can endure on behalf of others. But Jung exposed the deception buried inside this logic. He argued that self-abandonment, denying your own needs to sustain the comfort of others, is actually the most devastating act of violence you can commit against your own psyche. It is a slow-motion erasure of the soul. When an empath finally halts this cycle of internal destruction, something extraordinary occurs. They don't lose their capacity to feel deeply, and they don't lose their compassion. Instead, they gain something they've never possessed before: ironclad boundaries. They stop functioning as a sponge and begin operating as a filter. They exchange that infinite patience, which was, in reality, nothing more than a deficit of self-respect, for what Jung called psychological sovereignty. This means they become the undisputed rulers of their own internal world. They no longer seek permission to defend their peace. They don't negotiate with those who deplete them. They have finally grasped that their energy is a currency, and they are no longer distributing it freely to those who cannot recognize its worth. The shift into psychological immunity occurs the moment the fog finally lifts, and it arrives with the quiet precision of a key turning in a lock. For years, the empath has been pouring their life force, their time, and their sanity into a bottomless pit, believing that one day the water would rise to meet them. They've been drained, hollow, and desperate. Then, in a single, unremarkable instant of clarity, they simply stop. There is no grand eruption, no screaming confrontation, no theatrical exit. There is only a silent, internal no that permanently alters the chemistry of the relationship. They simply refuse to participate in their own destruction any further. They recognize that the well isn't just empty, it is fractured beyond repair, and no amount of pouring will ever restore it. This is precisely where the situation becomes chilling for the manipulator. A manipulator's entire strategy depends on two specific weapons: guilt and hope. They keep the empath tethered by manufacturing a sense of responsibility for the manipulator's happiness, or by dispensing just enough false hope that things will improve, if only the empath tries a little harder. It is a psychological leash that has held firm for years. But the moment the empath achieves genuine emotional detachment, they develop what can only be described as psychological immunity. It's as though they've been inoculated against the very tactics that once dismantled them entirely. Suddenly, the guilt trips that used to cause sleepless nights don't even make contact. The accusations of being cold or selfish no longer leave a mark. They dissolve into background noise. When this immunity solidifies, the manipulator's most lethal weapons become completely ineffective. The love bombing, those elaborate, hollow gestures designed to pull the empath back into the cycle, now appears transparent and desperate. The empath perceives the wires behind the performance. They are no longer looking through the eyes of a victim. They are looking through the eyes of a witness. The leash hasn't merely been loosened, it has been severed at the root. The manipulator will often intensify their efforts, deploying every technique available to provoke a reaction, only to discover they are grasping at empty air. The emotional hook that once lived inside the empath's chest has been surgically removed, leaving the manipulator with nothing to latch onto. What makes an awakened empath truly untouchable is that they are no longer operating from bitterness or a desire for revenge. Bitterness is still a form of attachment. It's a burning emotion that keeps you chained to the very person you resent. But the awakened empath has moved beyond that into radical acceptance. They don't despise you. Despising you would require energy they no longer choose to spend. Instead, they simply see you accurately. for the very first time in the entire history of the relationship. The distortion of hope has evaporated. For years, they never perceived who you actually were. They saw your potential, or the version of you they desperately hoped would eventually emerge. Now that lens is shattered. They observe the patterns, the deceptions, and the emotional vacancy with a clinical, haunting precision. In this state of radical acceptance, the empath releases the crushing weight of trying to rescue or transform you. They have removed the compassionate filter that once excused your most destructive behaviors. They no longer subscribe to the lie that their love is a healing force capable of restoring someone who refuses to do the inner work themselves. They see the relationship without illusion, and they understand that there is nothing left worth fighting for, because there was never a genuine partnership to begin with. In that moment of absolute clarity, the manipulator forfeits every last fragment of leverage they ever held. You cannot control someone who no longer craves your validation, no longer trembles before your anger, and no longer believes your promises. The game is finished because the empath has finally understood they were the only one who was ever truly invested. The power of indifference is the final stage of an empath's evolution, and it is the most formidable position any human being can occupy within a relationship. This is not the calculated indifference of someone attempting to appear unavailable or gain the upper hand. This is an indifference forged in the fire of deep, painfully earned wisdom. When an empath finally stops caring, they don't become a villain or grow cruel. They lack both the energy for malice and the belief that you're deserving of a grudge. Instead, they simply become unreachable, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. They don't pursue revenge because they've realized that the most profound payback isn't causing you pain, it's rendering you irrelevant. They vanish from the equation of your life entirely, leaving a silence that no amount of noise can penetrate. In this state, the empath undergoes a sweeping behavioral shift that leaves the other person disoriented and grasping. They stop justifying themselves. They stop defending their reality. Most critically, they stop trying to make you understand their perspective. For years, they may have pleaded for your empathy, composed lengthy messages explaining their wounds, or remained awake until the early hours attempting to repair a misunderstanding. Now, there is only silence. They have arrived at what Jung described as psychological completion, the point at which their internal world has become so solid and self-sustaining that their sense of value no longer requires even a single fragment of your approval. They don't need your agreement, they don't need you to acknowledge their perspective, and they certainly don't need your permission to be finished. This is the precise moment an empath becomes truly dangerous. People tend to assume dangerous means someone capable of erupting or causing chaos, but the most dangerous person is the one who has absolutely nothing left to lose where you are concerned. They are dangerous because they are finally capable of walking away and never once looking back. No apology exists that is grand enough to reach them because they no longer assign worth to the words leaving your mouth. No promise that things will be different this time can draw them back into the cycle because they have finally read the blueprint of the trap. You cannot manipulate someone who has severed their heart from the outcome of the relationship. The true magnificence of this transition is that the empath has discovered something infinitely more precious than a toxic bond. They have found their way back to themselves. They have recognized that their ability to feel deeply, to care profoundly, and to nurture with devotion was never a flaw. It was an extraordinary gift they were squandering on someone incapable of honoring it. By reclaiming that gift, they are finally restored to wholeness. Once that gift is withdrawn, the balance of power shifts permanently. You are no longer engaging with a sponge willing to absorb your toxicity. You are confronting a sovereign force that you can no longer sway, move, or manipulate. They have returned home to who they always were, before the world deceived them into believing that suffering was the price of love. When an empath is done, they aren't simply leaving you. They are arriving at their own doorstep, and they are locking the door behind them. Ultimately, the withdrawal of an empath's care is the loudest silence you will ever experience. It signals the moment they understand that their light is far too radiant to be extinguished by someone whose only ambition is to diminish it. They have traded the exhausting cycle of rescuing others for the liberating truth of rescuing themselves. Their departure is not an act of war. It is an act of self-preservation. They are not walking away to wound you. They are walking away because you no longer possess the power to wound them. This is the ultimate transformation, the day the emotional sponge becomes an unbreakable wall.